So I'm Ellen, and as you've just heard, I'm in the final year of my PhD at Durham University. And today I'm going to be presenting some ongoing research which predominantly focuses on how museums' online content was impacted by the pandemic. And while I have 45 minutes, I have an awful lot to convey in that time, because what I'm going to present is really the culmination of a series of different studies. And honestly, I'm going to present it broadly chronologically and study by study, so to speak. And while I might come to regret this later, I wanted to be completely transparent so that you can see the journey I went on and the messiness of the research process. Now, I first began with a very small pilot study which looked at the online presence of 315 accredited museums. And that looked at museum accounts across 5 different social media platforms. And it was presenting this that led to teaming up with the wonderful Mapping Museum project team, including Fiona Candlin and my future co-authors, Jamie Larkin and Andrea Ballatore. So they'd been building a near comprehensive list of museums in the UK. And using web scraping and social media APIs, they had gathered data on over 3,300 UK museums over the course of 3 years. And working together, we were able to perform a more detailed analysis on Facebook and Twitter before expanding to look at websites as well. And then finally, in order to try and better understand the trends we were seeing, I followed this up with supplementary interviews with over 20 museum practitioners. And in fact, you'll be hearing a lot from the interviews today because the people I talked to were better informed and funnier than I can ever hope to be. So I began from a really simple starting point. After a series of incredibly disappointing experiences during lockdown, in which I was wandering around virtual galleries, doing the usual, bashing into walls, having it crash on me, not being able to turn my camera angle appropriately, I became incredibly frustrated. I thought there had to be something better than this, and innovations from the gaming sector, digital marketing, and computer science could massively improve the online audience experience. And so a PhD was born, and I began with 2 very basic questions. I wanted to know what museums were doing online, and in and amongst everything they were doing online, what was working well. And it turns out that figuring out what an entire sector has been doing over the past 5 years is not simply the case of a simple literature review. I might have been a bit over-ambitious. There was far less large-scale quantitative research than I had anticipated. In fact, there was very little data overall about the sector at this point in time at a large scale. But I had to start somewhere, so I began testing my methodology to gather this data, picking, as I mentioned, a representative sample of 315 Arts Council's accredited museums. But before I go into detail, a really quick show of hands, and I promise I'm not going to pick on anyone. Who amongst you here has an active Facebook account? This is very interesting. And out of curiosity, who has a Twitter account? Pretty much the same people, actually, and a TikTok account. Yeah, okay, interesting. Let's bear this in mind, right? Because the majority of museums have chosen Facebook as their main social media platform, and 85% of accredited museums have an account. But as you can see, not every platform has been adopted with the same enthusiasm. On TikTok, you'll only find 7% of UK museums who are accredited. Meanwhile, on Snapchat, I couldn't find a single one out of the 315 museums who had a presence on the platform. Now, considering that a survey conducted by Nesta found that 20% of museums use social media exclusively to reach younger audiences, this is interesting, right? Because 2/3 of UK Facebook users are over the age of 35. Sorry, if you're embarrassed of having put your hand up earlier, I'm right there with you. In contrast, over half of TikTok and Snapchat's users are under the age of 35, so they're young platforms. And this is probably a contributing factor to the findings of the Audience Agency, who conducted an 18-month-long survey into digital content during the pandemic. They found that over half of museums' online visitors were over the age of 55. They also found that most of them were likely to be regular in-person visitors, suggesting that social media use hadn't really broadened or diversified museums' audiences in the way that they had hoped. And before moving on entirely, I do want to talk about TikTok a little bit more, because it's not really going to feature in the rest of this presentation. Not nearly enough museums use it to actually make it a viable thing to add to my visualizations. And while this 7% has probably gone up, this data was collected in 2022, still, most of the big players you would expect are not on TikTok. The largest of this sample, the British Museum and the Royal Academy, still don't have accounts on the platform. And this has caused some confusion online. The British Museum, as I said, still doesn't have an account. And as you can see here, there are over 6 pretenders on the platform, none of which are verified. And let's not get confused by the Natural History Museum, which is right there in the middle. Now, this sounds like a very minor thing, but if you have ongoing controversies about theft within the museum, the Parthenon sculptures, and the repatriation of objects with colonial legacies, it's not clear, not having a clear official channel means that there's an opening for satirical counts or just plain misinformation. But that's the end of this very small diversion about TikTok. Back to our actual results. So having established that yes, museums are using social media, the next question is how that was impacted during the pandemic. And I decided to look at YouTube in particular, as with so many museums uploading online virtual events, virtual tours, curator talks, as their sites were closed, I thought it would be a site of likely change, which very much proved to be the case. There was a massive increase in the number of videos that museums uploaded to YouTube, but this didn't necessarily correspond with a larger audience. Our data flew in the face of widely reported anecdotal evidence. While museums were posting far more than they ever had before, levels of engagement were pretty static, and museum audiences didn't see any significant growth. The vast majority of YouTube channels have very few subscribers. Half of museums' accounts have 45 subscribers or less. Over the pandemic period, only the 2 largest museums in the sample, that's the British Museum and Royal Academy, saw any significant increase in the number of views they were receiving. And we found a similar trend across the 3 years of Facebook and Twitter data, which you'll see later. In fact, across all social media platforms, you'll generally see that large museums tend to have significantly larger audiences. Now, this is completely unsurprising, right? They have dedicated social media staff, they're far more likely to be able to publish things regularly and put out high-quality posts. And by that, I don't mean the content itself, but they're likely to use a proper camera or have high production values. But is it true that a video with more views is necessarily better? I think we all instinctively know that's not necessarily the case. We're for the most part aware that there's a host of different factors contribute to the popularity on social media, but I wanted to discuss how difficult navigating this can be. Up until this point in the talk, we've implicitly adopted the belief that more views is better. And being honest, in interviews I've been conducting, the consensus has also been along these lines. But by looking at a few examples, we really see that this doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Working on the assumption that museums would like large online audiences, I wanted to look at some of the best performing videos and see what they could show us about successful online content. So my starting point was the single most popular video on the most popular YouTube channel in the dataset. This orange line here represents the view count of Vikings Live, a video uploaded by the British Museum at the height of the first pandemic lockdown, and it's still their most watched video today. Now, it's pretty unusual when it comes to YouTube content, as it's over an hour and a half long, and it was created in 2014 and broadcast straight to cinemas live. Originally, it was taken in the form of a documentary, and the presenters, Bettany Hughes and Michael Wood, take turns interviewing key staff members, experts, and as well as having live demonstrations and some incredible animated graphs. Now, on YouTube, the success of this kind of long-form content is relatively recent and still unusual. The average YouTube video is less than 15 minutes long, and the platform is dominated by individual content creators, not institutions. Content designed for other platforms often underperforms compared to what they refer to as native YouTube content. Yet at this point, Vikings Live has over 8 million views. So this could be interpreted as fantastic news, right? Museums don't necessarily have to conform to what we expect to do well on social media. If you make something interesting, people will watch it. But you might have noticed that there's another line on this graph. This bluish line, potentially more grey, it represents the views of Pompeii Live. And this video was uploaded a week before Vikings Live. It's remarkably similar. It was recorded in 2013 and broadcast live to cinemas. It has the same format and the same presenters as Vikings Live. Yet, despite their similarities, Pompeii Live has less than 500,000 views and is only the 24th most popular video on the museum's YouTube channel. Does this mean that Vikings Live is more engaging or a better video? Well, by looking at how the number of views have changed over time, it's possible to see why this kind of question can be a bit misleading. The initial reception of both videos was very similar. There's an initial rapid increase in the number of views that slowly reduces for both videos, and this is often called a log normal distribution. And that's pretty standard for YouTube videos, in part because the platform favors new content. So it's far more likely to be recommended to users. I probably don't need to tell you this considering the age range of the audience I have today, but when you come to the end of a video on YouTube, there's tiles at the end of the video as well as a bar on the right-hand side, which suggests things that you might be interested in based on your watch history. Now, similar kinds of recommendation algorithms are in place for pretty much every social media platform we've discussed. These often dictate what users see when they log in and are usually under some kind of personalized For You page. Sometimes these systems will recommend a post far beyond an account's usual audience. However, it's a black box algorithm and we don't really know how it works exactly. And here, as an aside, I'm going to make one of those annoying academic distinctions that we will circle back around to at the end of the talk. And that is that recommendation algorithms make something discoverable. If you don't know something exists, you might be able to stumble across it and learn of its existence. And that's what they're really, really good at. But platforms are surprisingly bad at making things findable. And that's if you know something exists, but you simply can't get the platform to show it you. If you've ever struggled to find an old post or a video to show a friend or prove a point, you might know what I mean. And this is something I'll return back to at the end, but for now, the end of this second diversion. Because on YouTube, being recommended a video massively affects the number of views it's likely to have. The first video in that recommended list on the right-hand side is 6 times more likely to be clicked on than the one at the end of that same list. Despite Google, who own YouTube, providing very limited information about how these recommendation algorithms work, research has reconstructed what kind of attributes we expect to see in that video, although this comes with the caveat that the recommendation algorithm changes all of the time. But it generally favors posts that are recently uploaded, accounts that post regularly, high-resolution images, video content, and short posts. But notably, it does always change, so we're normally a couple of steps behind where the algorithm is at any point in time. And we can see just how large of an impact the algorithm has by going back to our previous slide. Here, the video of Pompeii Live clearly follows the expected log normal distribution trend of the number of views over time. Despite what many people might expect, there is no increase in views during the second lockdown period, which you might expect if people were discovering this organically by going to the British Museum page. After all, these two videos are right next to each other. But as you know, both from your own experience and from a plethora of different studies, that's not the way most people discover content on social media platforms. It's all through recommendation algorithms. Now, why the algorithm picked up one and not the other isn't entirely clear. As I said, black box algorithms. But it does happen to be that Vikings, not Romans, were on the primary school syllabus at that time in the UK curriculum. And on top of that, the Vikings TV series had just been released and the Assassin's Creed game was due to come out very soon. But it's all speculation really, as the amount of resources a museum can spend chasing an algorithm and chasing trending topics and trying to get their collections to fit into those categories can be enormous. The British Museum's senior producer, Nick Harris, has acknowledged the effects of the algorithm himself. In a video posted on March 2023, he asked audiences to give the new videos a like when they come out. We would really appreciate it, as it massively helps build the algorithm, which, to be honest, hasn't been that kind to us of late. If the British Museum, with its extensive digital team, is struggling to successfully navigate platforms like this, what hope do the vast majority of museums have? Conceptualizing platforms as even playing fields is completely misleading. A former researcher at Microsoft, Tarleton Gillespie, noted even the use of the term platform has obscured the way that sites such as YouTube shape online spaces. Platform downplays the fact that these services are not flat. He argues that the act of claiming to be open and neutral spaces to everyone obscures the interventions and choices intermediaries like Google make. So how do we evaluate content in this kind of online space? is success going to be defined by who can best adapt to the whims of the algorithm? It has two really interesting impacts on the museum sector. Firstly, museums are unable to control the context in which their content is seen or who it is shown to. On sites such as YouTube, museum content is very likely to be shown to people who have watched museums videos before, or, and this is the more insidious part, share attributes with those who do. That can be a watch history, but it can also be demographic data. So instead of online content broadening museums' audiences, we may find it has the opposite effect. And museum videos are more likely to be recommended to their existing traditional visitor base. As something of an aside, you remember that long 18-month study run by the Audience Agency? Well, they found not only that online audiences consisted of people who were already engaged with museums, but where they did appear to have new users, it was actually people who were heavily engaged in museums in other areas, accessing organizations that were geographically distant from them. And it unfortunately wasn't people who had never been to a museum before, suddenly discovering it through their online content, right? And this is a process that's likely exacerbated by the recommendation algorithms. But there's a second worrying side to the way that platforms are increasingly acting as a mediator between museums and their audiences. So you already know there's a vast body of literature on social media and its impact on mental health, right? And it's increasingly been found that the most widely shared content provokes emotions. Alarmingly, a group of US researchers found that Facebook posts that rouse negative emotions are far more likely to be shared than positive posts. We've all heard about the negative impacts of social media, but I think there's a really prevalent idea that when it comes to outreach and engagement, museums are using social media for good. But ultimately, every museum is just another user, and they're bound by the same infrastructure as everybody else on the platform. This post came to my attention as it performed exceptionally well for a small Northern Irish library that, on average, generally gets a couple of interactions, likes, and comments per post. The post I've got up on the slide consists of an image of a photograph taken in 1997. That's towards the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The image shows a soldier with his rifle trained at the photographer, and the post, with its accompanying caption by the artist, John Boucher, was liked 101 times, has 3 comments, and crucially, was shared 42 times. For comparison, the previous post by the very same artist on the same topic, but this time consisting of an image of a frozen Union Jack flag, has 15 likes, 11 comments, and just 2 shares. And again across the dataset, it seems to hold true that content that inspires negative emotions is more likely to be shared, no matter what the intention of the poster or where it originates. So the question is, what would our online cultural landscape look like if museums were to optimize their content to reach the widest possible audience on social media? And this kind of brings me back to my initial set of questions, right? It seems unlikely that social media engagement is indicative of the type of audience engagement most museums are trying to foster. In fact, chasing good social media metrics can undermine museums' efforts to reach new audiences. But I hope I've made it clear just how difficult defining and evaluating success online can be. There's a real need for more nuanced ways to measure engagement. And here, this is where methods from computer science, including topic modeling, natural language processing, and potentially network analysis can be immensely helpful. But if we want to develop more sophisticated tools, we need the data. And getting the data is hard for a number of reasons, right? So we've already discussed the limitations of the metrics themselves and the fact that they tend to reflect what the platform is recommending rather than what people are discussing, enjoying, or what is educational. But perhaps most frustratingly, at the point in time when I was doing all of this, the APIs through which researchers can access this data was in a state of disarray, with the rules changing regularly and data becoming restricted. This is in part the kind of tail end of the backlash from the 2018 Cambridge Analytica scandal and the accusations of kind of election interference. But it perhaps culminated recently in the shutting down of CrowdTangle in August of this year, which is a tool many researchers use to gather public data from the Meta API. Now, it's been very difficult to access ever since, and we are living in what many scholars refer to as a post-API age. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself and mourning the loss of large-scale data for which we really haven't had access to for a long time. A lot of scholarship in museum studies relies on case studies, which is a wonderful way to highlight new projects. But unsurprisingly, most of the innovative work and projects are done at very well-resourced museums. And the Mapping Museum project team have done a fantastic job of looking at the way that unaccredited museums are underrepresented in scholarship and policymaking. Now, the unaccredited sector is much broader, about twice as large as those museums that have accreditation in the UK, and there is a great diversity in that group. Some of them are run by volunteers and have staff stretched across multiple roles, and it's this kind of museum that is currently absent from a lot of our narratives about museums and social media. And this is where we get to move on to the second of the two studies. Considering everything I've just said, I came up with a plan to start gathering qualitative data through interviews so I could at least broach what was working well in the eyes of museum professionals. And I guess at least to kick worrying about the APIs away for a couple of months. But in the meantime, I was incredibly lucky, and a fortuitous run in the conference meant I was able to now collaborate with the Mapping Museum project team, who had collected 3 years of museum social media posts across Facebook and Twitter. Having already wrangled with the APIs once, I was ecstatic that that's not something I would have to deal with again, especially in the immediate aftermath of Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. And part of the advantage of this data was that they had collected data about unaccredited museums as well, and they provided a completely new perspective. They can be volunteer-run, and their digital capabilities are much more varied than our accredited counterparts. One very memorable interviewee summed up the position of hundreds of museum practitioners. For all my sins, I'm the only one of us that understands the ITs, I guess because I'm younger. The interviewee, in his early 70s, had used email at work before his retirement and therefore had been nominated by the trustees to handle all things digital. And when you look at the data across all of the museums in the UK, you can start to see just how little the pandemic affected this kind of museum's digital following. Looking at engagement with museums' Facebook posts, here we have comparisons between different types of averages and sums compared. What we found was that there's an increase in the small number of posts that go viral, generating a lot of engagement. That's this bump here. That raises the overall and mean levels of interaction, the top 2 lines. But looking away from the very top performers to the median, we see that it's relatively stable. At its peak, it rises by a single interaction or 2 per post. And when we put this in the much larger context of a couple of years, it falls within the general fluctuations you'd expect to see. And Facebook is the platform that museums are best at by a long way. More than 50% of museum tweets don't have a single interaction at all, and we've already heard about YouTube. In a parallel to what we saw with existing scholarship, there's this gulf between the most digitally able museums and their less digitally savvy counterparts. On Facebook, this is the most extreme, with 1% of accounts receiving 60% of all the interactions with museum accounts on the platform. So what are these posts that are going viral and generating all of this engagement? Well, we already have a strong suspicion, don't we? Of the top 20 most shared posts on Facebook, 8 were about war, 2 about missing animals, 2 more about natural disasters, 1 about an individual's death, and the remaining 7 a bit more positive. Though I'm using that term pretty liberally, considering that 3 of them were about venomous things, including the fungi whose tendrils burrow into the brain of a leafcutter ant and turn it into a zombie. So, emotive stuff. The same was also true on Twitter, where controversy is rewarded. Now, I've pulled out an example here. It's very cute. This is Boo, who went missing just before Christmas in 2020. And there was a massive effort to reunite her with her family. And I can say happily, before anyone gets upset, she was found safe and sound and returned home. But the search for her brought a community together, and it was enabled by social media. But posts with such a clear call to come together and a literal call for action have a negative side effect as well. One museum that I will keep entirely anonymous noted in an interview that their top performing post was the theft of a baby animal. Underneath what was genuinely a heartfelt plea for its return were comments that were full of unprompted vitriol against the local traveller community that some individuals had, without any evidence at all, suggested were responsible for the crime. Considering that most museums bill themselves as an inclusive space for open and nuanced dialogue, this kind of interaction could not be more contrary to their mission. So in the face of everything we've learned, I wanted to explore a different model for what types of social media success can look like. Amongst the 3,300 or so museums, there had to be someone who was doing things differently. And I've drawn out two examples from the data, and the first became apparent when we started exploring the data set by the subject of museums. Now, this graph shows museums grouped by the type of thing in their collection, for example, arts, industry, nature, and their average number of followers on different platforms. And we can start to see that the different platforms have different audiences. On Twitter, archaeology is actually surprisingly a high-performing category, while on Instagram, a very visual platform, it's generally art, which makes sense. But notably on both Facebook and YouTube, they're completely dominated by transport museums to, as you can see, a rather impressive extent. Now, this seemed strange, and the posts of transport museums are often very detailed, very long, and pretty dense for someone who's not interested in trains. And this all flies directly in the face of general social media advice. But when I began interviews with museum professionals, it turns out that absolutely everybody has a story about transport. One interviewee at a small local history museum recounted posting about their acquisition of a vintage car. I just happened to put a post on Facebook. The next thing I know, there's a national newspaper that said they had to come and take pictures. It's falling apart, but they don't care. Everyone's been on the phone. And then, when we investigated this using the bigger data sets, the enthusiasm for transport was even more obvious. On Facebook, the median number of interactions on a regular post is 15. Relatively high, but for a transport museum, the number is over 3.5 times higher at 53. This is also true for any post that touches on transport. We performed topic modeling, and transport dominated the top 10 most engaging topics. I have my hesitations about some of the models we've been using anyway, and I realized today actually that there's a far simpler way of explaining this that might be a lot more intuitive to understand. So green here indicates posts that contain words, post-lemmatization if anyone's interested, that are associated with transport. So that's train, gauge, carriage, and for comparison, we have levels of engagement with posts containing words surrounding war and conflict in red, cute animals in blue, and museums' core objectives in orange, before moving on to sales and commerce in pink. And we've visualized how they compare with average levels of engagement across the platform, which is the dotted line in blue. And here you can see the uncomfortable finding that I alluded to earlier raising its head. Posts about war here in red, generally high levels of engagement. Topics about war in our topic modeling also ranked very highly, with World War II especially seemed to be a cultural touchstone. Actually, there's been some really interesting work done on how the far right co-opt certain moments in history, and I'm thinking of Ben Miller's work at Emory University, but there's lots of other examples. Frédéric Calvert has also found that there's a strong association between right-wing politicians like Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, with historical imagery in generative image prompts. For example, picturing them as knights riding into battle. And when we did a network analysis of mentions on Twitter, which I'm not going to go into that much today, we found that while the vast majority of the communities were geographically based, museums that focused on war and conflict were a little bit different. They had their own bubble, and in and amongst that community were many right-wing politicians in the UK, no left-wing politicians at all. And this is a very complicated topic on which there's a lot of work, and we kind of just brushed against it, but there's plenty more if you'd like to explore, so please do get in touch with me if you'd like the bibliography. And in a very dramatic tonal shift now, and a more light-hearted vein, I can confirm that there's a bias towards kittens on Twitter. This unusually high blue bar on the right is twice as high as Puppies, which is right next to it. But most clearly, posts about transport on both Facebook and Twitter do really well compared to museums' posts about learnings, tickets, exhibitions, or their shop. Posts to do with trains in particular have very high levels of interaction, which I can tell you came as a complete shock to everybody who works in a transport museum. They thought it was completely normal that every single one of your posts received hundreds of likes and interactions. So this begs the question, I presume, is transport just inherently engaging? Or some people have argued that it's because it has a very niche community who are very passionate about it, but the people who it attracts extend far beyond what many people consider as a stereotypical transport enthusiast. This is Francis Bourgeois, one of the breakout TikTok stars in the UK. He has over 3 million followers and now his own series on Channel 4. His videos are about train spotting and entirely consist of him getting very, very excited about railways, in part due to his choice of platform. The vast majority of his audience are under the age of 25. Now, one of our interviewees had a great theory about the universality of transport. Even if you're not a big car or train person, people like transport because it's so nostalgic. As a subject, I think you remember what car your parents drove when you were little because you have so many visceral memories of sitting in the back seat. And true, a small minority of visitors are really, really keen. While they didn't record figures, multiple transport museums across the UK referred to regular international visitors. One small rural museum in the middle of Wales received visitors from the US, Norway, Japan, and Germany all within a week. And this is important, as for most museums, there's a resignation that what you do on social media won't convert into visitors in your physical site. To quote a highly successful social media manager, 39% of our social media audience live in the US, which means that it's highly likely that 39% of people that follow us are never actually going to come and visit the museum. But it's interesting because we've repeatedly found that people are willing to travel to remote rural locations, and tourists, especially those from the US, are willing to travel to what many in the UK consider unfathomable distances. And this is where our second example comes in. Looking back at the data, when we carve it up a little bit differently and group museums not by subject but by location, we see something else that's really interesting. On Facebook, level of engagement with Scottish and Northern Irish rural museums are second only to London, which includes many of the biggest museums in the country. And on Twitter, Scottish rural museums are the top performers. So when I started my interviews with museums across Scotland, I spoke to one that was entirely run by volunteers, and it came out that they had received over £250,000 from a single donor who shared his name with their local town. With no children or descendants, he decided to donate his estate to help preserve their local archive, having never been there in person. The next interview shed some light on the matter. Word is obviously getting out. It's probably true of many small museums in Scotland because of their diaspora. The family and club names that came from this area generate interest when people are doing family history research in the States. And the more Scottish and Northern Irish museums I spoke to, the more the impact of the Highland clearances in Scotland, forced deportation to Australia, and Irish economic immigration became apparent in digital audiences. And the evidence kept piling up. There are too many to read, and this is only a fraction of the quotes, but it was of a scale that I hadn't really anticipated. One small Scottish museum, who kept accurate visitor logs, reported that 16% of their visitors were from the US. Now, bearing in mind, this place is over an hour's drive from the nearest town, no matter the nearest city. And the more museums we spoke to, the more we found they were experimenting with new ways to engage with these international audiences. Some had been hosting online video talks and charging for them. Just a few pounds, but they also gave visitors the option to round up with a donation, which generated a really significant income. And the appetite for this seems significant. A Northern Irish museum reported that 30% of their regular attendees for online talks were from the US. Others we spoke to provide on-request digitization services for archival documents, as well as genealogy services, and are looking for ways to monetize this, especially as interest in ancestry continues to rise. But it seems that developing infrastructures for this is still in its infancy, in part because these audiences that have been reported peaked during the pandemic, with staff and volunteers returning to front of house duties when everything reopened in 2021. They simply haven't had the time to produce this kind of content since the pandemic. But they're still receiving constant requests from visitors and are hopeful they can recapture some of that momentum. Now, granted, these audiences don't bear much resemblance to those of transport museums. But is there anything we can take away from how both of these groups have grown their online profile? I told you I'd come back to this. Now, both of their digital strategies fly in the face of conventional social media wisdom. They don't necessarily post regularly, they don't conform to the latest social media trends or talk about news or celebrities. Their content is obscenely long, both in text and with videos running to multiple hours in duration. And in fact, they don't really do anything that would increase their chance of being shown to users via the recommendation algorithms. But they've created incredible, in-depth resources for the people who are there looking for them. They've channeled their limited resources into being findable, not discoverable. you're not likely to stumble across their content by chance, which is what discoverability and recommendation algorithms are all about. But if you go looking for it, you will find it. And for the people who do have a personal connection with these places and objects, it can be incredibly moving. And it's true that these museums are not necessarily diversifying their audiences, but if we remember, social media is a pretty ineffective tool for that anyway. And to reach beyond your existing base, to chase the recommendation algorithm requires the resources and expertise that most museums simply don't have. Unless I get a little bit sentimental, I think there's something that audiences deeply appreciate in authenticity, of both shamelessly not conforming to wider trends, but also of dedicating time to remembering and archiving things that might be considered a little bit niche, or things that have direct relevance to only a handful of people. To quote the American author Jacqueline Woodson, if you generalize, it doesn't resonate. The specificity of it is what resonates. So this has been a bit of a roundup of my work on social media, which I thought might be of kind of most interest. These days, my work focuses more broadly on transparency, and I'm particularly interested in absence in digital collections and the way we communicate uncertainty through interfaces. Applying a similar concept, but at a more technical level, I'm working with some fantastic colleagues about how we communicate uncertainty in useful ways when we talk about AI models, specifically around parameterization. And there's obviously so much you can do with this data, and this has really been a summary. So if you'd like to hear more, or have any questions that we don't get around to today, or if you just like a bibliography, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So please do get in touch. Thanks.